What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. Thank you so much for tuning in. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Depending on how you look at it, we're living in a very interesting time as far as fantasy adaptations go. Some people will tell you that it's a great time for fantasy adaptations. A lot of other people will tell you that it is a terrible time for fantasy adaptations, and I think both sides are right in their own ways. On the plus side, the good news is that a lot of fantasy adaptations are being made, and it looks like a lot more are going to be made. That's good. We finally get to see some of our favorite fantasy stories brought to life on the screen. That's great. The bad news is that a lot of the people making these adaptations either aren't familiar with the source material, or they flat out don't like the source material, or refuse to, familiarize themselves with it. Or sometimes the best case scenario is that they do like the source material, but the studio that they work for has forced them to stand by the sidelines, like a sad husband who has unwillingly been forced into an open marriage, while the studio takes everything unique and charming about the story that they're adapting, and then spanks it raw until it becomes an overproduced Michael Bay tier fanfiction. That is the current state of fantasy adaptations today. I'm going to be ranking these entirely off of how much they entertained me, not necessarily how objectively well or poorly made they were from a filmmaking perspective. But with that said, let's get the, biggest, most iconic fantasy adaptation out of the way, The Lord of the Rings. I don't think there's anything that anyone in the entire world could say at this point that hasn't already been said about this trilogy. It is, in my opinion, the best film trilogy ever made, not just within the fantasy genre. I think it is, even in all the ways that it changed things from the books, which I have made a video about. If there is any fantasy adaptation worthy of the rank of bussin', it would be Lord of the Rings. So we go from Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit, and I'm going to tell you right now, I do not hate The Hobbit as much as a lot of other people do. It was fun, and it's a kind of movie trilogy that I can rewatch every now and then. Although, it's made by Peter Jackson as well, so it can and it should be compared to Lord of the Rings. And when you stack it up against Lord of the Rings, it just doesn't hold a candle. And it's not just because The Hobbit is a vastly different type of story. Lord of the Rings was meant to be this sprawling, epic, just larger than anything kind of fictional fantasy story, whereas The Hobbit was originally just this one book, intended for children, in fact, about a little fantasy creature going to steal some treasure from a dragon. And I'm assuming because of, the studios again, they were forced into a corner where they had to turn this into the next Lord of the Rings and make it another 3-movie series. And unfortunately, that resulted in a much worse product than it should have been. I think here's the thing about the Hobbit movies, right? I think they had the perfect opportunity to make something quite different in regards to fantasy adaptations, because a lot of fantasy adaptations, even then around the time that The Hobbit was made, felt like they had to be these enormous, sprawling things. But we've learned since then that that's just not entirely necessary at all. For example, like The Witcher, which we'll get to in a bit. I think we've proven by now that fantasy fans, even fantasy fans who don't read fantasy, are interested in shorter, more self-contained kind of stories. And they had a perfect opportunity with The Hobbit to just tell a fun, short, one-movie fantasy story. It would have been great, I think. But unfortunately, that's not what we got. We got, a bit of a bloated mess. They injected a whole bunch of shit that just had no business being in there. And my biggest gripe with The Hobbit, which is a weird one, is that weird, glossy Snapchat filter look to the entire trilogy. I don't understand what's going on there, and I hate it. That is, even more so than the story, I think that's the main thing that kind of throws me off rewatching it, is I can't stand that glossy, weird look. It just doesn't look right. Anyway, I know a lot of people would put The Hobbit in minor or even fat L. For me, it's just meh. I didn't hate it, but it's not good. I don't think I could say it's good. Again, it just comes down to whether I was entertained or not, and generally speaking, it's pretty easy to entertain me, but when I do hate something, I I hate it, and we'll get to that. Percy Jackson, we're talking about Logan Lerman's Percy Jackson, considering they're going to be doing a new Percy Jackson series, right? I think it's going to be a TV series, which is such a better idea than a set of movies, by the way. This is another one where a lot of people really hate it, but I actually didn't mind it. Even the second movie I thought was pretty fun. But then again, I did watch it when I was a lot younger. You know what? I'm gonna roll the dice on this, and I'm just gonna say I think it was better than it was. Yeah, it was definitely better than The Hobbit in my opinion. I'm gonna give it a low noise, high meh. Yeah, it didn't quite capture the magic of, you know, the books, which is why I'm not putting it in bussin'. But I do think the Percy Jackson movies fulfilled their intended purpose, which was to pull the kid watching it away from the real world and into kind of like a whimsical, fun fantasy experience. Dune. Now this one is an interesting one because, hot take, I hate the book. I'm sorry. Like, I appreciate that the story is fantastic, but it's been said by a lot of people that the writing is it's like Vegemite. Like, you either like it or you don't. And unfortunately, I don't like Frank Herbert's writing. I can't stomach it. It's so dense, man. It's so... Reading a single page of Dune was like trying to chew a styrofoam pillow. I struggled with it a lot. Although I can admit again that the story is insanely unique and very creative and clever as well. That's one of the major things, is it's a very clever story. Frank's obviously an incredibly intelligent guy. The movie, however, I think is bussin'. God, that was fantastic. I'm gonna put it in a mid-bussin', so just under, you know, Lord of the Rings there. Story-wise, it's really good, but the thing that really brings it up into bussin' is just how insanely beautiful the movie is. Cinematically, I mean, watching this movie, there are very few movies I can think of where it is a noticeably better experience if you watch it in the cinema, and Dune is absolutely one of those. It's top of the list for that. If you hadn't seen Dune in the cinema when it was out, I think you might have missed out on a real great opportunity, because it was just insanely beautiful to watch. It was a spectacle. And you know, aside from that, they managed to adapt some incredibly complicated and dense source material into a movie, one movie so far at least, that was pretty easy to understand. I don't think I know anyone that saw the movie and walked out going like, I have no idea what was happening there. I have no idea what they were doing on Arrakis or what the purpose of spice is. The filmmakers managed to get the message across pretty clearly. I would say a lot better than it was done in the book, in fact. And in the very rare instances where you can say that the movie was better than the book, I think that warrants a bussin' rank. Game of Thrones is an incredibly difficult one for me to rank because I'm not going to beat a dead horse here and go over how much of a absolute train wreck season 8 was, because it was, but a lot of us do let the fact that season 8 was so bad take away from just how much of a global game changer Game of Thrones was. I don't think, to this day, I've ever seen anything like it. When Game of Thrones was releasing, you know, like weekly, and the entire world would stop for that day. I'm pretty sure when it started up, it was before like the streaming boom of Netflix and stuff too, but literally everyone you knew was talking about Game of Thrones, and every week when the new episode dropped, everyone was talking about what happened, or they were, you know, running past with their fingers in their ears going la 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 because they didn't want spoilers. It was a phenomenon. It was a global phenomenon, and I think that does have to bump it up quite a bit, even though the ending was so bad. There were a lot of writers and actors and, you know, cast members, crew who contributed to this show being as good as it was, and unfortunately, I don't want to just say it was all ruined, you know, just by some crappy decisions made right at the finish line. However, you know, if not for season 8, I would have given it a bussin', but I can't because the end was so bad, and that's what the show was. The show was build up to a conclusion, to a clashing of all these different groups that we've been following for years and years and years. The whole point was to see them clash finally, and when we did, it was bad. So I think I can't even give it a nice because of how bad it was. I'm gonna give it a high meh. And going from Game of Thrones, we go into House of the Dragon, and we're ranking it off of, where it's at so far, which is 1 season in. And I gotta tell you, I'm really enjoying it. It doesn't have quite the epic magnitude of Game of Thrones. It doesn't fill me with the same sense of just utter spine shaking. It doesn't fill me with the same debilitating, crippling, spine shaking excitement as Game of Thrones did at the start, so I can't really rank it as high as I would have for Game of Thrones, but it's really good, and I really do love Matt Smith, and I think he's fantastic in this. Considering House of the Dragon is a much more intimate story than Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is about a ton of different families across an expansive world and an undead army that are on the way and all this kind of stuff. House of the Dragon is much more about one family. It's very intimate, even if that family is all shagging each other. But I think it's told well, and more than anything, I think the acting has been fantastic, especially the actor for King Viserys. So I'm going to put it in a high noise. It is definitely better than Percy Jackson, easily. In fact, even putting it in the same row as Percy Jackson doesn't feel entirely right, but let's keep in mind Percy Jackson is a low noise, and House of the Dragon is a high noise. I can't really put it in bussin', but maybe as the seasons go on. Next up is Rings of Power. Oh boy. I'm not gonna go into a whole red-pilled rant about, Rings of Power, but I will say this. It sucked. It wasn't good. A lot of the acting is fine. I actually thoroughly enjoyed the parts with the, Hobbit ancestors. I thought that was actually pretty fun. The mystery of the wizard, which I guess is still kind of a mystery at this point, was okay. But yeah, at the end of the day, Rings of Power was not good. I'm gonna put it in a low minor L because I didn't hate it as much as a lot of other people did. There were a lot of changes from the Silmarillion that don't actually bother me quite so much, because the thing with the Silmarillion is it's not a narrative, so to speak. It's not like a book that you can just adapt. It's more so just a set of information. So to make this a narrative, they had to add stuff. That's just a fact. They had to do that, and I'm okay with Galadriel being a drastically different character to the one we see in The Lord of the Rings, considering how much time passes between then, and she does have points in her history where she is referred to as being somewhat of a warrior. It's kind of up in the air. I'm okay with that as long as they still sewed in the seed of the character she is to become, the Galadriel of The Lord of the Rings, and I just didn't find that anywhere in her character. I found her thoroughly unlikable for pretty much the entire thing, to be honest. But more than everything else, the worst crime Rings of Power did for me was just being almost entirely forgettable. I barely remember half of what happened in any given episode. I remember the general overarching story, but the finer details were all pretty forgettable for me. Wheel of Time now. Wheel of Time, I've only read book 1, which I guess season 1 of the show was meant to have covered. I think it included a few things from the later books as well, but I honestly don't think there was really any redeeming qualities for the Wheel of Time show, unfortunately. I'm gonna put this one in fat L. I have to, because even worse than Rings of Power, this show was forgettable, it was boring, I was struggling to find myself connecting on any emotional level with any of the characters involved. My biggest point for the Wheel of Time adaptation versus the book would be that reading the Wheel of Time book felt like, a fun, whimsical, if not dark at a lot of points, fantasy adventure. Watching the show felt like a miserable, chore. All of the characters were just miserable, all of the time, and I understand that it makes sense within the story. Their home was just torn to pieces by a bunch of monsters, sure, but that was the case in the book as well, and the book still managed to capture an atmosphere of fantasy, whimsical adventure, and the show just didn't have that. It just felt like morbid. A lot of the storytelling decisions for the Wheel of Time were just utterly baffling. Like there's a character death at the end that I think was just, we know at this point that it wasn't a real death, it was a fake out. I think the director came out and said that. But what was the win in that death? Like, what was the win-win for that? If it was real, that would have been a monumentally and incalculably dumb decision. If it was a fake out, which I guess we know now that it was, what was the point? Was it like a cheap grab to try and like make people emotional right at the end of the show? It's just that, and the like climactic moment of like, you know, when Rand is doing the thing and like they build it up to be like this epic war that's about to happen that's going to rival Helm's Deep, the Battle of Helm's Deep, and it ends up just being like one little scuffle and an explosion, and that's it. You know, I disliked season 1 of Wheel of Time to such an extent that I honestly don't even know if I'm going to bother with the next season. I just don't know. I didn't like it. So I left The Witcher for last because The Witcher is easily in my top 3 like fantasy IPs of all time. I adore The Witcher in pretty much every aspect. It's one of my favorites. And I'm very conflicted when it comes to the show because I don't remember if people hated or loved season 1, but I thoroughly enjoyed season 1. I really liked it. In fact, if we hadn't gotten season 2 so far, I would have put it in a mid to high nice because it was really good in my opinion. I think it had all the ingredients for what could be a remarkable adaptation. More than anything else, we have an actor, we have a lead who is a huge fan of the source material, which I think is just one of the best things you can have for an adaptation. However, season 2, when I first watched it, a few of you might remember I had a review up for a bit. I've taken it down now because I made a review for season 2 the instant I finished watching season 2, and I was still so hyped up on how that season ended that my judgment was completely clouded. I ended up raving about it and being like, oh, season 2 was so good. And then I was kind of sitting there and days were passing after watching season 2, and it was like an itch in my brain where I was like thinking about certain moments from the season, and I was like, that wasn't great, was it? And the more I thought about it, I just spiraled into this thing of saying like, wow, season 2 of The Witcher kind of sucked. Like, it wasn't great. Like, there were a lot of changes. Again, I'm okay with changes from the source material as long as it's an improvement or sustains the quality of the source material, but there were a lot of decisions that just weren't good. I still think that the Nivellen episode was one of the best Witcher episodes out of both seasons, and I think it kind of carried it. And I really liked Ciri in her like training phase of her life, so that was fun as well. But for the most part, there was a lot of other baffling decisions made, and just what they'd done to Henry Cavill. I'm not going to give my ranking here for The Witcher off of the future of the show, but because for all we know, it could end up being amazing. Highly doubtful, but could happen. But yeah, with season 2 in mind, I have to give The Witcher a low noise. I'm not very hopeful for the future of The Witcher, which is unfortunate to me because, again, it's one of my favorites. But there it is. There are my rankings so far. I would love to hear what you think about my opinions. Again, emphasis on the word opinions. How did you feel about any or all of these adaptations? And more importantly, here's a question I want to pose to you. How do you feel about the future of adaptations? The Last of Us just came out, and I don't know if you would consider that a fantasy so much. And apparently that has just been a huge, colossal win for the adaptations community right now. So could we hopefully be seeing a bit of a trend towards more faithful adaptations of showrunners who actually have familiarized themselves with the source material and like the source material, which is just baffling to me. That should be a prerequisite. It should be almost where the bar is set at the lowest for making an adaptation is liking the thing that you're making the adaptation on. It feels insane to even have to say that. Thank you so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make videos all the time on fantasy books and all that kind of stuff, so if you like that, then stick around. I'd love to have you. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.